It's so great to have you all here and to begin another year of our Learning and the Brain series. This is a little bit different than being in the lecture hall, and so we're interested in what you think about this. For me, this is more ideal in terms of learning and community building and so on, and our numbers exceeded tonight what would fit in the lecture hall, so there's a kind of a practical reason as well. So I want to welcome you here, and I want to get a sense of who is here. There are name tags on your tables, so if you're at a table, it would be great if you just put your first name on, because as well as learning about introversion and extroversion tonight, this is our opportunity perhaps to get to know someone else from our community that we might not have known before tonight. And so it's an important piece as well. How many folks who are here tonight have attended a Learning in the Brain session before, in previous years? Hands up. Oh, you came back. That's awesome. How many are here as junior school parents? Okay. How about middle school parents? How many are here as middle school parents? And finally, senior school parents. I don't know if you're looking around, but it's always neat to see how there's a great representation across all three schools. How many folks are here as guests of a SMOO family? Because we've certainly opened it to the community and we welcome you. Hands up, please. That's great. Welcome. Good to have you here. And finally, how many are here who are faculty or on staff at St. Michael's? So there's a number of us around. And I'm always impressed with my colleagues that after a long day of work and going home to Mark, and then they come here as well. It's pretty neat. So just a couple of housekeeping things as we start. You'll notice on your table, there are these little wee sheets. We're going to have a draw. We have 5 of Susan Cain's books, Quiet. Hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll be curious enough to kind of want to read that. So we'll ask you to fill that in. We'll be coming to that later. The other thing I want you to notice about this little piece of paper is that it's blank on the back. And if there's anything that strikes you tonight, a topic you're interested in, or some suggestion you might have, or something that you really liked and it resonated with you, please feel free to jot that down on the back as feedback for us as well. All right. So, what are we going to do? What are the goals for our session tonight as we explore this idea of introversion and extroversion? Through the course of some activities, we're going to define and describe exactly what we mean by these terms. They're thrown around a lot, and I've talked with some of you coming in, and we all have kind of different ideas about that, so it'll be interesting to look at what that actually is. There is a quiz on your tables. My colleague and I were giggling a little bit because we thought maybe the introverts were here at 20 to 7, just getting in quietly to their seats and looking at what was available to read, and some of them read the quizzes and filled them in, so we are watching you. We know who you are. But we're going to give you some time tonight. Don't feel any pressure to fill that out right now. And I mean, part of the reason that we're here is because we're parents and we're educators, and we're forever looking for ideas and ways that will support the journey that we're on as parents and educators. I was chatting with one mom and we were saying there's no book, there's no manual for this. And so I think it's important that we can gather and share ideas and just add to our toolkit as both parents and educators. I need to let you know that I'm not a brain expert or a parenting expert. That may disappoint some of you. I am someone who is passionate about brain research, and I'm a parent of 3 children who are now 23, 21, and almost 18. And that job of parenting is my #1 job. And so from those places, I'd like to create a space for us to kind of learn and grow together. So what are we going to do? I'm doing the welcome now. We're going to do something called Chalk Talk, which I'll explain to you in a minute. We're going to do some defining, look at some links. We always want to think about whatever the topic is and how it links to brain research. That's just interesting. I'm going to show you a small clip from Susan Cain's TED Talk, which I hope you'll go home and watch the full thing. And then we're going to talk about some strategies. One of the challenges that I face in this context is that I know a lot, or I've done a lot of reading about brain research and learning. And what I know is that if I stand and talk to you for an hour, in about 15 to 20 minutes, you'll begin to make your grocery list and wonder about how the hockey pool is doing and think about a million other things. And so part of what we do here is on a couple of levels. One is we're going to look at some research together. The other is we're going to learn together about what learning has evolved to at this point. Many of us were in school a while ago. I know I was. And the stuff that happened then, some of it we've learned how to do a bit better and maybe a bit differently. And so that's part of what goes on here. So you'll see what I mean in a minute as we go through. I want you to think for a minute as we head into this. Where does introversion and extroversion show up for you? I want to tell you just a very brief story. I became first aware of this concept because I was a teacher and I took my first mat leave for my first child. And I was at home, all day, every day with a 3-month-old. And I'm a bit of an extrovert. I'm actually pretty close to the edge now, but then I was even more of an extrovert. My husband was also a teacher. He was a middle school teacher and quite introverted. And so if you can picture the scene at the end of the day, I've been with a 3-month-old all day long. Some of you can relate to this, right? And there's not a lot of deep discussion going on or connection. There's a lot of changing diapers and, some cooing that was cute, but not a lot. My husband has been managing middle school kids all day long, and he's an introvert. And so I hear the key in the door, and I'm like, woohoo, someone to party with, someone to talk to. I'm so excited, real person, right? My husband's putting the key in the door as his last act of, I can finally get sanctuary. Finally, peace and quiet will reign. And so you can imagine, and perhaps there are places in your own life where you have these temperaments that kind of bounce up against each other, and you're sort of thinking, how do we navigate this? And certainly, an awareness and an understanding of what we each were in terms of temperamentally, where we sat on that continuum, gave us then awareness and language to kind of say, okay, you need a few quiet moments. It's not personal, I get it, right? And then I need you to take the baby. I'm going out. So just really understanding these is important. All right. So on your tables, you will notice that there is a piece of chart paper and some markers, and actually a couple pieces of green tape. Let me explain for you what this process is going to look like. And I need to tell you that in my teaching career, there was a period of time I worked in the public system, and it was in a class of mostly behavioral boys doing behavioral management. But I have never managed a class this big. So I'm gonna tell you how we're gonna do this, and I'm gonna trust that it'll work together. So what's gonna happen in a minute is that you'll see the question. Everyone has the same questions. What are the characteristics of introversion and extroversion? What I'd like you to do when we say go, and you're gonna have 10 minutes, is you're gonna pick up the chart paper off the table, and you're going to find a space on the wall to tape it up. And your whole table is going to follow the chart paper. Okay? And you're going to have a conversation. However, here's the deal. It's a silent conversation with the beautiful markers that have been placed on your table. So the question is there. Someone writes a quality of introversion. Someone else writes a question mark. Like, what do you mean by that? And they go, or someone writes something and someone else goes, yeah, and this and this and this. So whatever you might say to answer that question at the table, you're going to write. Oh, you thought I was just coming for wine and cheese. She's making me get up, and I know. It's tough. It's like an experiment, and we might even be setting a world record on this strategy tonight. I'm not 100% sure. The trick of this, and I really need you to do this with me, trust the process, and then we'll debrief it in 10 minutes. I have a timer. It's silent. There is no speaking. You are speaking with your marker. Does that sound challenging? Whoa. So take an extra big gulp of your wine And grab the chart paper, head to the, but please, let's try to do it silently. I'm going to put the timer up. Okay, and just as you're settling back at your tables, I want you to think about what that process of chalk talk was like for you. You might have different folks. Some people might have really thought it was fun and others not so much. So what was that like for you? Just chat with your table group for about a minute or two about that, and then we'll come back together and move forward. I'm really curious, and I wonder if a couple of you might share, just very briefly, what was your reflection in terms of the activity, the silent conversation? Any thoughts for people? Did you like it? Did you not? What did it feel like? Somebody? Yeah? It was great. What made it great? Everybody had to wait for the other person to finish. Okay, there was another. Yeah?
Yeah, related to that, everybody got a chance to get their idea out there, even if you're someone who tends to let the other guy speak first.
Nice.
A lot of times you have to know how to spell.
Yes, it's true, and it kind of puts you on the spot there. Good to know. Good to know. Other thoughts? Yep.
For an extrovert, it's really hard to
Yeah. How many of you found that a challenge? Like you want to speak, and it's like, I'm going to do a marker. Good to notice. There was an intention in this activity. I hope you've made the connection with it as well. Was there a hand up back there? No? Okay. So part of the thinking in doing that strategy to start off is twofold. One is brain research loves when you kind of prime the pump. In teaching, we call it activating prior knowledge. And when I was walking, I could see that you all know a fair bit about introversion and extroversion. Right? And so you've got your brains ready to kind of learn any new tidbits that might go in there. The other thing is, and this Susan Cain starts her book like this, is what strategies can we use? And it goes back to the comments from back there that give equal voice. Susan Cain's book is talking about quiet, the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking, right? And so when we put in place something like that, it kind of evens the playing field a little bit. She starts her book by saying that she went to Harvard. She was beginning the research for quiet, and she was sitting in the business school, and they were doing one of those scenarios where, you know, it's a survival. I think we have basketball going on the other side of the wall, if you keep hearing that. Anyway, they were doing one of those, your plane crashed in the Arctic, and you have 15 things, and you need to rank them in order of how important they will be to your survival. And the group discussed it, made the ranking. The ranking was marked against experts, and they also got to see a videotape of how they were as a group. The group that she was really interested in had a guy in the group that had survived in the North. I mean, he'd made a career of living in the North, and he was an introvert. And so he would say, in a voice that maybe wasn't quite as assertive and quite as compelling, what he thought, and someone else in the group who was more extroverted would say, I think it's this, I think it's that, I think it's that. And they went with the extroverted, confident person, because that's what we tend to do anyway. And so what they noticed was that they ended up with a much less chance of surviving but they had followed the person with the voice. And when the students were watching the video after, you know, they saw where their ranking was, they saw where they'd made their errors, they said when less vocal people put out the ideas, they were discarded. And the students felt really embarrassed by this. The ideas that were discarded would have kept us alive and out of trouble, but they were dismissed because of the conviction with which more vocal people suggested their ideas. So really interesting to think about, and it's been her quest in this book, Quiet, to really explore that. How many of you have read Quiet already? Okay. You can check up on me. Susan Cain is formerly a corporate lawyer and a negotiations consultant and a self-described introvert. She would have wanted to be a writer, but she started off as a lawyer. She got her law degree at Harvard Law School. And she said of herself, she found the law, getting her law degree a trial. That was her own pun, as she had to speak up so much in front of people. So she began to see that introversion and introverts were not getting the voice that they needed. And so she wanted to research and discover and think more deeply about that. And for her, she says, Quiet is not just a book, it's a mission. She wants to help parents and educators and workplaces better understand what they may be missing. We're going to hear a little bit from her in a little bit, but on your tables, there's a quiz. I know some of you have done it, but many of us are first seeing it now. And so I'm going to give you about 2 or 3 minutes to kind of go down the quiz and rank yourself true for the answers that are true for you. We're short. So, as you look at your responses, and this is not a heavy-duty scientific quiz. It is the quiz from the book Quiet. And as you look at your responses, if you answered true, the more true that you answered, kind of the more introverted on that continuum, and I want us to kind of think about it as a continuum. If you were roughly equal, there's a new term that I hadn't heard before that she introduces called ambivert. So that you can take that home tonight and say, I'm actually an ambivert. I am actually an ambivert. I'm right on the brink. So you can see that it's a continuum, and that you may, as you reflect, find that in different contexts, different parts of who you are emerge. And that may also be true for your students. And they would say, even if you answered every single question as if you were an introvert, it doesn't mean that your behavior is predictable across all circumstances. It isn't. Stuff changes, right? And so we think of it as a continuum, and we have varying degrees of that. Interesting when you think about your children and where they would fit. And as we move through tonight, we want to be cognizant of that. I'm just going to skip through the timer. Sure I am. We have this thing about being in the gym that technology can be all set up and then it tells me to restart. I don't want to restart. Sorry. You can't see anything, but okay. So let's just go on and continue looking at the definitions while we wait for the technology to catch up with us. Originally, Jung was the psychologist, Carl Jung. In 1921, he wrote a book called Psychological Types. And that was the very first time that we kind of heard the language around introversion and extroversion. And he talked about an introvert as someone who had a lot of inner thoughts and feelings. An extrovert was drawn more externally to the outside, to people and to activities. Introverts would try to make meaning of events around them, whereas extroverts want to just sort of plunge into those events and enjoy them. The really big piece, and this continues to show up as we look at definitions, is how do introverts and extroverts recharge? Oh, thank you. So, you know, we typically sometimes can stereotype an introvert as someone who's shy. I saw that come up a few times there, and we're going to talk more about that as we go along. But the definition that Jung started with and the definition that the Myers-Briggs uses now, and we'll look at that in a minute, is really a lot about how do you recharge? How do you gain that, you know, equilibrium back after a busy day? And introverts would tend to want to recharge by being alone or doing something quiet and reflective, whereas extroverts would want to be with people. Hence the little cartoon in the bottom. You've got an extrovert going, I'm staying in tonight, a little depressed. Or an introvert going, woohoo, I'm staying in tonight. So the difference between both of those folks. So on your handout, there's handouts on your table. This chart is there, and it's taken from the Myers-Briggs. And again, just as you look through it, you'll see the criteria. I don't have to read it to you. It's there. I'll just give you a minute to kind of look at it. How many of you have had a Myers-Briggs assessment done at some point and could say I'm an ENFJ or whatever the, yeah. So that's just another, and introversion and extroversion is one of 4 sort of criteria on the Myers-Briggs, and it's used in a variety of settings. We use it here with our leadership students. 40 prefects this year. Are doing the Myers-Briggs and learning where they fit. It's a little more in-depth than just introversion and extroversion, but it's one of the, introversion and extroversion are one of the pieces of it. So just to notice there, does that compute? Is that kind of what we were writing when we did Chalk Talk? Those ideas. Another little, I like some of these. I mean, the pictures are whatever they are, but the sayings, you know, he's got the whole world in his head. That's an introversion. Or she's got the whole world in her hands. And the learning styles, an introvert is think, 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 do, think. And of course, an extrovert is do, 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 think, do. Right? Those are stereotypical, and we've talked about it being a continuum, but I think they're good little reminders. So what's the brain science around this then? How does this connect? And what sort of pieces need to be pulled in? Now, many of you said you've been to these talks before, so that's good. We can kind of build on what we've learned about before. In Quiet, Susan has an opportunity to explore with a scientist out of Harvard, the Child Study Center at Harvard, by the name of Jeremy Kagan. He started in 1989 a longitudinal study that is still going today, where he started with 500 4-month-old babies and then just interacted with them throughout their lives. When they were 4 months old, they were brought in for a 45-minute assessment. And his hypothesis was, in 45 minutes with these children, I will be able to tell you whether they will grow into introverts or extroverts. It's a pretty noble goal. And so they brought these babies in, and within the evaluation, he and his colleagues exposed the babies to some carefully chosen stimuli, and some of those included tape-recorded voices, a balloon popping, watching colorful mobiles, smelling the scent of alcohol on the end of a Q-tip, those sorts of things. And what they noticed at 4 months was that 20% of these babies, their arms and legs went and they cried loudly, lustily, I think he even said. They moved their arms and legs. They had quite a reaction to that stimuli. Another 40% stayed quiet. I don't know what that was. Stayed quiet and placid. They were pretty calm. And the other 40% were somewhere in between those two extremes. So Kagan predicted, somewhat counterintuitively, that those babies that were flailing their arms and crying would become the introverts of the future. of that group. And then he continued to meet with them when they were 2, and when they were 4 and 7 and 11, all the way through. And at different points, they would do different things. I think at one point they met a lady wearing a gas mask and a lab coat. They were treated to a clown. When they were 7, they were asked to play with kids that they hadn't met before. When they were 11, they were interviewed by an unknown adult about their lives. So they intervened kind of all the way along. And at this stage, these kids are well into their teens. And he's actually been pretty right. That those kids that were the loud crying ones have become the introverts, and the others, the extroverts. Mainly, like it's science, right? So it's a percentage of them. But what he ended up saying was, he called that 20%, the sort of ones that were crying, high reactive. And the high reactive babies turned into the more introverted teenagers and upper teens. So what does that even mean? Like, why would he have said that? Going back to what we've talked about in terms of science. So in addition to adding the stimuli, the people, the comments, the noises, he and his team also measured things like heart rate, blood pressure, finger temperature, other properties of the nervous system. And the properties they measured were controlled by the amygdala. Don't know if you remember, but that's that little almond-shaped part of our brain that is kind of our fight or flight response. And so what he noticed was that amygdala kind of acts like an emotional switchboard. It receives signals and sends signals out to the brain to say how we're going to react, what we're going to do. So Kagan thought the children with the excitable amygdala, he called it, would be highly sensitive. And he imagined that as they went through life, new situations and new things, they would continue to be highly sensitive to. They would continue to maybe need some time to adapt. Whereas the others were kind of unmoved by novelty. They didn't have that same level of sensitivity in their amygdala. And the more reactive the child was, the more sort of movement and so on, the more cortisol, which is a stress hormone, was found in their saliva. So what he was saying to us is, sometimes we say, well, introverts, they're shy, they're kind of uncomfortable with people. And his point was, actually, introverts are just highly sensitive people to new situations. And so when our children go to kindergarten and we watch that reaction, or when they're playing with friends and we watch them interact, there's a level of sensitivity there, and it's not a criticism at all, it's just how they're created. And so it gives us great information in terms of how to help them to integrate and how we need to set up situations. We're going to talk about a couple of those as we move along. Having said all of this, Kagan would say we're very complex beings, right? It's not a cut and dry thing. I don't want you going home tonight going, oh, my child's high reactive. I don't know. We're on a continuum. And this is just insight. What does our brain do during these moments? There was another scientist that took Kagan's work and wanted to go further, and he started to talk about something called an orchid hypothesis. And he saw certain kids that were very sensitive. He said many kids are like dandelions. They can survive in just about any environment, right? They grow up, but they're dandelions. And then there are the kids that are the orchids, that under some difficulty they can struggle, but if they're treated well and watered just right and moved along, which we'll talk about some of those things, they become these amazing orchids that can survive. So he was going a little deeper and looking at that, and others have picked that up as well. The idea of the orchid child. So what does this all mean? Because some of us as adults, you would say, well, I'm an introvert, but I stand up and speak to people, or I go out to parties, or I work in a thing where I'm on all the time. How does that happen? How are we able to do that if we, in fact, fit more into that introverted category? The prefrontal cortex is another part of our brain that we've talked about over time. That's that part behind your forehead, kind of the reason, the voice of reason in your head. And the prefrontal cortex kind of soothes the anxiety of our amygdala. So that when we're going into some of these situations that might be new and might be a little bit stressful, our prefrontal cortex is there busy sort of telling us, it's okay, you've done this before, this is going to be okay. You know, it's that reassuring voice. And it's really a great thing to help us do, and that's how many of us, including Susan Cain, can stand up and do what we do. The interesting thing is that if the brain gets busy with something else, some of you know people who have fears, right? And they've done, you know, I'm afraid of heights, so I climb to the top of a building over and over and over again to get over that. And I kind of do, except for sometimes I'm not. I'm still afraid. Why does that happen? And so, again, Susan Cain was talking to another scientist where they experimented with rats. And they trained these rats that when they heard a sound, they'd get an electric shock. So they got programmed to hear the shock and hear the sound and be afraid of the shock. And what happened was they stopped shocking. So you just have sound, no shock, sound, no shock. And so the rats, over time, their fear diminished. Okay, there's no shock that comes with this. What they noticed was when they cut the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala on these rats, they were afraid again when they heard the sound. In other words, their theory is that when our prefrontal cortex gets busy with something else and we're going into a new situation, it's trickier. And we're more likely to default to the places where we're fearful or anxious. So that's why we can kind of do some of what we do. I want to just share about 5 minutes of Susan Cain's video, her TED Talk. It's quite amazing. I've put it on your resources, and I'm hopeful that you will be able to watch the whole thing when you go home. What I'm really hopeful for is that all the testing we did ahead of time will bring it up now. I'm going to just go in again to the whole thing. Yeah? Yeah, I wasn't going to. There we go. It's not on the screen? Why is it not on the screen? Huh? Where was that? Oh. Okay. Will you help me get back to my PowerPoint after?
When I was 9 years old, I went off to summer camp for the first time, and my mother packed me a suitcase full of books, which to me seemed like a perfectly natural thing to do, because in my family, reading was the primary group activity. And this might sound antisocial to you, but for us, it was really just a different way of being social. You had the animal warmth of your family sitting right next to you, but you were also free to go roaming around the adventure land inside your own mind. And I had this idea that camp was going to be just like this, but better. I had a vision of 10 girls sitting in a cabin, cozily reading books in their matching nightgowns. Camp was more like a keg party without any alcohol. And on the very first day, our counselor gathered us all together, and she taught us a cheer that she said we would be doing every day for the rest of the summer to instill camp spirit. And it went like this. R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, rowdy, rowdy. Let's get rowdy. Yeah. So I couldn't figure out for the life of me why we were supposed to be so rowdy, or why we had to spell this word incorrectly. But I recited the cheer. I recited the cheer along with everybody else. I did my best. And I just waited for the time that I could go off and read my books. But the first time that I took my book out of my suitcase, the coolest girl in the bunk came up to me and she asked me, "Why are you being so mellow?" Mellow, of course, being the exact opposite of R-O-W-D-I-E. And then the second time I tried it, the counselor came up to me with a concerned expression on her face, and she repeated the point about camp spirit and said we should all really work very hard to be outgoing. And so I put my books away, back in their suitcase, and I put them under my bed, and there they stayed for the rest of the summer. And I felt kind of guilty about this. I felt as if the books needed me somehow, and they were calling out to me, and I was forsaking them. But I did forsake them, and I didn't open that suitcase again until I was back home with my family at the end of the summer. Now, I tell you this story about summer camp. I could have told you 50 others just like it. All the times that I got the message that somehow my quiet and introverted style of being was not necessarily the right way to go, and that I should be trying to pass as more of an extrovert. And I always sensed deep down that this was wrong, and that introverts were pretty excellent just as they were. But for years, I denied this intuition. And so I became a Wall Street lawyer, of all things, instead of the writer that I had always longed to be, partly because I needed to prove to myself that I could be bold and assertive too. And I was always going off to crowded bars when I really would have preferred to just have a nice dinner with friends. And I made these self-negating choices so reflexively that I wasn't even aware that I was making them. Now, this is what many introverts do, and it's our loss for sure, but it is also our colleagues' loss and our community's loss. And at the risk of sounding grandiose, it is the world's loss, because when it comes to creativity and to leadership, we need introverts doing what they do best. A third to a half of the population are introverts. A third to a half. So that's 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know. So even if you're an extrovert yourself, I'm talking about your coworkers and your spouses and your children and the person sitting right next to you right now. All of them subject to this bias that is pretty deep and real in our society. We all internalize it from a very early age without even having a language for what we're doing. Now, to see the bias clearly, you need to understand what introversion is. And it's different from being shy. Shyness is about fear of social judgment. Introversion is more about how do you respond to stimulation, including social stimulation. So extroverts really crave large amounts of stimulation, whereas introverts feel at their most alive and they're most switched on and they're most capable when they're in quieter, more low-key environments. Not all the time, these things are an absolute, but a lot of the time.
So that's an intro. I might be able to just, from Susan Cain, and I would really encourage you to click on that link and follow it through, because she speaks about education, she speaks about workplaces, and she speaks about celebrating what we have to offer. So what does this have to do about parenting? How does this connect with us as parents who've given up our time, thank you, to be here tonight, to think about it? She brings a couple of case studies out in Quiet that I found really interesting. One is about a boy named Ethan. He's 7 years old, and a psychologist, Dr. Miller, has this child brought to him by his parents. His parents are successful, outgoing people, and Ethan has a 4-year-old brother that's essentially beat him up twice. And the parents are worried that Ethan just doesn't have the fight in him. He's got to get this fight in him. But he loves to read books, and he's not that into sports, and he has friends, but just a couple of really good ones that he enjoys. And so the parents bring Ethan to Dr. Miller, not once, but 4 times. And Dr. Miller says, he's fine. This is who he is. He loves to read, and he has friends, and he does the assessments he needs to do, but he's good. It's good. And finally, the family says okay, and then Dr. Miller hears that they've found a psychologist who will actually treat Ethan and help him to get better. That's sad. The second story is about a girl named Isabel. She's in grade 2. And she's been pretty, caring and kind and compassionate. She's invited to birthday parties. But as she's moved into grade 2, her mom's noticed that she's not socializing quite as much. She drops her off, and Isabel goes off by herself a little bit more often, and she picks her up, and she's sitting off by herself. And so mom's a little worried about this. She's a little anxious about this. And the mom's name is Joyce, and she knows Susan Cain, and she had a chat with her. And Susan said, well, maybe Isabel is an introvert. Maybe she just likes quiet time. Maybe you need to have a conversation with her and see kind of what's going on for her. And so it's interesting, because then also Susan Cain had a chance to chat with little Isabel. And this is what she said as a 7-year-old child. And there's a note at the bottom. This is really her words. School is hard because you have a lot of people in a room, so you get tired. I freak out if my mom plans a play date without telling me, because I don't want to hurt my friends' feelings, but I'd rather stay home. I like hanging out with my mom after school because we have thoughtful conversations. I like having thoughtful conversations. They make people happy. And so what happened in this relationship was that Joyce, the mom, began to work with Isabel and say, okay, so you want to leave the birthday party a little early. I get that. You're okay with that? Then I'm okay with that. And so they started, and what about at school? How do you find those quiet times? And so mom became a support and an advocate for Isabel as she explored who she was and what she was passionate about. So just a couple of thoughts here that Susan Cain writes that I'll just let you have a look at as advice, and then there's a couple of concrete things I want us to talk about. These thoughts come up in articles that I've put on your sheets, so you can find them if you want to. So some suggestions from Quiet for parents of introverted child. If your child is reluctant to try new things or meet new people, expose them gradually. So her whole thing is don't let kids opt out of everything, but understand that, again, going back to that high reactivity or high sensitivity, you might need to scaffold that. You might need to support that a little bit as they get together. She says, inch together toward the things that he is reluctant to do. And so supporting your child in that step. And also praise and recognize. I saw you talking on the steps to that child the other day. That was great. I know sometimes that's hard to do when you're tired at the end of the day, or whatever the language would be that would support that. The interesting thing, she has a really strong feeling about the word shy. And what she says about that is shy is a fixed trait. And so she's saying, don't let your kids hear you calling them shy, and if someone else does, maybe retranslate that. Because if it's a fixed trait, we talked about Carol Dweck's work last year, and shy is a fixed mindset term, so it doesn't allow the children to see themselves as on a continuum of growth and learning in this area. So just notice, it's not a judgment, but just notice when you typically might use that language and think about some other way to kind of frame that. If someone else calls your child shy, say, well, you know what, Sophie likes to take her time to figure out new situations. That's okay. There's a bit of a stigma attached to shy, and Susan Cain's pretty adamant about being careful about using that term. The other thing is, if you're an introvert, maybe don't project your own experience. Sometimes some of us grew up as introverts. There were some tricky things, stories like Susan Cain told about camp and, those experiences. But it's a whole new world. Your child has you as a parent. They have a different world to live in, and so to be really careful not to project that. And the really neat thing about introverts developing, and this is that whole orchid child phenomenon, when these kids are turned on to things, their passions are amazing. And so what are the passions, and how do we find those for our children so that we can explore them and develop them together? It's interesting, I was thinking and reflecting on this as I was preparing, and I often think about St. Michael's, obviously, in the context of the topic that we're going to be talking about. And what I noticed was that there's a lot of things we've put in place structurally here already. I mean, we're on a continuum and we're always learning. But structurally, we have chapel at least once, twice in the senior school every week. That is a quiet, reflective space for kids to just be. And that, as an introvert, is a great thing. We're careful about class size. And that, as an introvert, is a great thing. We also grade against standards. We don't grade for participation. That's a whole separate conversation, because we want to know when we give a child a grade that what they know about the topic. So, again, in some systems, kids are graded on participation. And unless you're going to do a chalk talk all the time that equalizes the voice, you won't get what introverts know sometimes. And so we grade on standards. So interesting too, I see a lot of blends of group work in the classes that I go into as I work with teachers. I see individual work, I see pairing, I see clusters, and I see that switching up. We're spending a lot of time and energy really trying to figure out how kids learn in our school. We have a new initiative, which I'll be telling you more about in January, that's Pathways to Student Learning. And that's just making more intentional these conversations about the passions and strengths of our kids. So it was really neat for me to be reading through Susan Cain's work and going, I'd like to invite her to our school. I think she'd kind of like it here. Having said that, these are things that educators can do to continue to create a space for both introverts and extroverts in their classrooms. This is on the bottom of your handouts, so just a little how to care for introverts and extroverts. You might want to put it on your fridge at home and have a conversation as a family about that. Whatever you want to do. So I hope that it's a big book. We're going to draw for it now. But I hope that I've given you a bit of a glimpse into this idea of introversion and extroversion, that it's a continuum, that it's about how we're energized, that we need to find space and time to hear everybody's voice, and that as parents and as educators, we're seeking to help our kids find their passions and what they love to do. And so this is just another kind of way to get at that and understand that, another lens, if you will. I'm going to just tell you kind of what's upcoming, and Laura's going to come. We're going to do a draw. So if you have your sheets available, let's start with folks that are new tonight. We have a special bucket for you. Laura will. So if you're by new, I mean if you're new to the SMOO community, like you're a guest. That's what I'm trying to say. If you're a guest, put your hand up, and Laura will collect that. And then in a different bucket, Becky will collect. Can you help Laura? The other for everybody. And just while those collections are going on, so our theme this year is celebrating our strengths. And the next session is November the 18th. And we're going to look at the work of Marcus Buckingham. And he's done a lot of work with Gallup and celebrating our strengths. And then in January, we'll look at fulfilling student promise, and we'll have an opportunity to kind of share with you what we're doing around that piece and talk also as parents about that. And I know a number of you were here in Brain Awareness Week last year. We had a doctor come in, a neuroscientist, speak to us. And so I'm not sure who it'll be this year, but Brain Awareness Week is up there. Just want you to put that on your calendars. We'll have an event for the community during that week for sure. So I will be around after to chat. If you wish to, it's a large group to kind of do questions in. Help yourself, there's a bit more wine. And I thank you very much for taking the time on behalf of your kids to come out tonight. It's awesome. Thank you.